Ethan Carter was on top of the world. At 45, he had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the United States, he had amassed an impressive fortune and lived surrounded by luxury. His mansion in Los Angeles was a true palace, with large glass windows offering a stunning view of the Pacific Ocean. It was there that he lived with his wife, Rachel, and their 2 children, Tyler and Emily. That morning, Ethan stood in his living room, watching the sunlight sparkle on the waves. The phone kept ringing, and his schedule was packed with meetings with investors and business partners. He usually started the day with a run on the private beach surrounding his property, but that morning, the rush prevented him from going out. The demand for his projects was immense, and he was about to close a deal that would put him even higher in the real estate market. Rachel appeared at the living room door, holding a cup of coffee, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes. "You've been working too much, Ethan," she said softly but firmly. "The kids barely see you, and you're hardly ever home." Ethan turned away from the view and forced a smile. "Rachel, you know how it is. This is temporary. I'm securing our family's future. Once I close this deal, everything will calm down." She sighed, not looking convinced. "I just don't want you to lose sight of what's really important." But for Ethan, business success had always been his primary goal. He was determined to expand his company to international levels and become the biggest name in luxury construction. His schedule was so full that he rarely attended Tyler and Emily's school meetings, and nights with Rachel had become less frequent over time. Despite his success, something in Ethan's life was starting to feel off. He had noticed some suspicious behavior from his partners, Mark Benson and Daniel Woods. They had been holding secret meetings, claiming they were to discuss internal company matters, but Ethan felt there was more to it. However, he decided to ignore these suspicions, believing that in the business world, small secrets were common. "Mark and Daniel are in too much of a hurry to close this new project," Ethan thought as he prepared for another meeting. But what could go wrong? Ethan Carter woke up that morning without imagining that in a few hours his life would be destroyed. As he got ready for another workday, surrounded by the comfort of his luxurious mansion, the world seemed perfect. But fate was about to take a cruel turn. When the doorbell rang, it was just the beginning of a nightmare he had never foreseen. Opening the door, he was paralyzed. 3 police officers and 2 FBI agents stood before him, their expressions stern. Ethan barely had time to process what was happening when the lead agent raised a warrant. "Mr. Carter, you're under arrest for financial fraud, money laundering, and corruption." Time seemed to stop. Those words, so unimaginable for a man of his stature, echoed in his mind like a violent blow. "This is a mistake," Ethan shouted, his voice choked with shock. He looked at his wife, Rachel, who had come down the stairs with Emily and Tyler. The horror on Rachel's face was almost as devastating as the handcuffs closing around Ethan's wrists. "Rachel, I swear, this is a mistake," he shouted, trying to move towards her but was restrained by the officers. Tyler, his teenage son, looked at his father with wide eyes of disbelief. Emily, too young to fully understand, began to cry and ran into her mother's arms. "You can't do this. He didn't do anything." Rachel tried to argue, but her voice failed. Neighbors were already gathering outside, drawn by the sirens and commotion. The magnate everyone respected, the man who built an empire from scratch, was now being led away in handcuffs by the police, exposed and humiliated. The car door closed, and Ethan looked back at his family, seeing the world he had built begin to crumble. His heart was racing, and his mind was spinning out of control. How did this happen? I did everything right, followed all the rules. The silence inside the car was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of sirens taking Ethan away from his old life. On the way to the station, camera flashes began to illuminate the car. The scandal had already exploded in the media, and Ethan Carter's name was now in all the headlines. "Real estate mogul arrested for $1 million corruption scheme," read the headlines on reporters' screens. In just a few hours, the man who had once been the icon of success had become the symbol of betrayal and greed. Sitting in the interrogation room, Ethan felt the weight of the situation for the first time. Sitting in a cold metal chair with a blinding light overhead, he looked at the detective in front of him. Questions were fired like arrows, each one loaded with suspicion. "Mr. Carter, can you explain the undeclared deposits in offshore accounts? Transfers of millions of dollars that never appeared in your company's books?" Ethan blinked, confused. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never done anything illegal. My finances have always been audited." The detective looked at him with contempt. "You expect us to believe that? The documents are clear. There are records of fraudulent transactions made directly from your company to secret accounts. And all the evidence points to you." With each accusation, the ground seemed to disappear beneath Ethan's feet. He knew he had never done anything they were saying, but the evidence seemed undeniable. The detective's words became a cacophony of information that didn't make sense. Who could have done this, and why? When Ethan returned to his cell, waiting for his lawyer to arrive, he felt the first real wave of despair. The handcuffs weighed on his wrists, but not as much as the humiliation and fear. He tried to call Rachel, but the call was ignored. The image of his wife and children watching as he was taken away by the police didn't leave his mind. He knew this was destroying his family. Let's play a trick on those who only read the comments. They won't understand. Comment chocolate. Below, only those who get this far will know. And now let's continue with the story. Finally, his lawyer, Michael Shaw, arrived, a young yet brilliant man with an impeccable reputation for fighting lost causes. But at that moment, even Michael seemed hesitant. "Ethan, this is very serious. The evidence against you is incredibly strong. Illegal deposits, transfers of millions. Everything points directly to you." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible, Michael. I would never do that. Someone must be framing me." Michael sighed, flipping through the documents. "Are you sure your partners, Mark Benson and Daniel Woods, aren't involved? There are transactions linked to them too, but much more subtly. It seems planned." At that moment, the truth began to unfold. Mark and Daniel, the two men Ethan completely trusted, they had access to everything. And now, as Michael pointed out the evidence, a new reality emerged. "They did this. They set me up," Ethan thought, feeling a rage rising like an uncontrollable fire. Returning home on bail, Ethan found a very different environment. Rachel was devastated. She could no longer trust him. Couldn't understand how her husband had gotten involved in such a serious scandal. The arguments became frequent, and their already fragile marriage began to crumble rapidly. The children, Tyler and Emily, felt ashamed to see their father involved in such a public and humiliating situation and started to distance themselves from him. Over time, the pressure became unbearable. Rachel suggested that it would be better if they separated for a while, taking the kids to stay with her parents while Ethan's situation was resolved. Alone in his huge mansion, with his business frozen, his assets blocked, and his reputation ruined, Ethan watched his life fall apart before his eyes. He tried to seek justice quickly, but the legal processes were long, and with each new hearing, the evidence against him seemed more overwhelming. Even knowing he had committed no crime, Ethan began to lose hope. Everything he had built was crumbling, and his own family was drifting away, unable to handle the public pressure. In the end, Ethan was sentenced to a long prison term while awaiting appeal. His life of luxury, prestige, and power had come to an end. The man who was once the most admired figure in the real estate sector now faced a harsh reality, surviving in an environment he never imagined knowing: prison. The heavy sound of the metal door closing echoed through the prison corridors, marking the end of an era for Ethan Carter. The gray, cold, and inhumane walls of that place starkly contrasted with the world of luxury and power he left behind. Now, there were no more boardrooms, million-dollar deals, or gala parties. What remained were distant screams, the smell of reheated food, and the clinking of chains reminding everyone they were prisoners, just like him. Ethan's cell was small, dimly lit, and the thin mattress on the metal bed seemed a cruel joke compared to the king-size bed he had in his mansion. Every detail of the prison seemed designed to break the spirit, and at first, Ethan didn't know how he would survive. The first week was the hardest. He wasn't used to the brutal reality of prison. Ethan, who was always seen as a powerful man, was now just another number in the system. People looked at him with disdain. The story of his fall had spread quickly, and the inmates saw him as a corrupt billionaire. who deserved to be there. Many resented him, while others wanted to test him, provoke the man who once had everything. On the first day in the yard, Ethan tried to keep his head down. While the other inmates walked in groups, exchanging looks and silent codes, he walked alone, trying to understand how he had ended up there. With each step, he felt the weight of the eyes fixed on his back, and it was only a matter of time before the confrontation happened. "Hey, billionaire, how does it feel to live like us now?" A voice echoed behind him, dripping with sarcasm. Ethan turned slowly and saw a group of 3 men approaching. The leader, a muscular man covered in tattoos, looked at him with a cruel smile. "You think you can survive here? Money buys everything out there, but here you're worth nothing." Before he could respond, the man shoved him, and Ethan stumbled, falling to the dusty ground. The other inmates around laughed, watching the scene with amusement. The humiliation he felt at that moment was worse than any trial he had faced. He quickly got up, trying to regain his composure, but inside, something was breaking. As the days passed, the hostility grew. Ethan was pushed in lines, constantly taunted, and even robbed. Sitting in his cell, he reflected on how he had come to this point. How a man who once had the world in his hands was now treated like a pariah, a criminal, a nobody. Ethan's thoughts were consumed by anger and pain. Anger at Mark and Daniel, the 2 men who betrayed and orchestrated his downfall. Anger at himself for being so blind and trusting. And pain, mostly, for the loss of his family. Rachel and the kids no longer visited him, and each passing day felt like an eternity without them. During one of those long nights of insomnia, when everything seemed lost, he met Lucas, his cellmate. Lucas was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a tired yet sharp look. He had been a lawyer before being wrongly imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. His story of betrayal and loss wasn't much different from Ethan's, and this created a silent bond between them. "You think you're alone in this, don't you?" Lucas asked one night, while Ethan tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. Ethan looked at him, surprised by the insight. "You don't know what I'm going through," Ethan replied, his voice filled with bitterness. "I know more than you think," Lucas said calmly. "I was also betrayed by people I considered my friends. They put me here, and now I'm trying to find a way out." Lucas approached and sat next to Ethan. "The system isn't fair, and you were caught in a bigger scheme. But that doesn't mean you have to accept it. If you fight, you can get out of here." Ethan looked at Lucas with a mix of distrust and hope. "How do I do that? The evidence is all against me. Mark and Daniel set everything up. How can I fight something so well planned?" Lucas smiled slightly. "You have to use what they used against you. The system. Justice can be slow and imperfect, but it can still be manipulated in your favor. You just need a plan." That night, Ethan began to feel a small glimmer of hope. He started spending more time with Lucas, who taught him about the system's flaws, how evidence could be manipulated, and how there was always a way to find loopholes in the law. With his vast legal knowledge, Lucas became a mentor for Ethan, showing him that prison didn't have to be the end. In the following months, Ethan dedicated himself to studying in the prison library. He read law books, analyzed every detail of his case, and with Lucas's help, started building his own defense. Although the environment around him was hostile, he now had a focus. Each day was a battle against the system that condemned him, but also against the inner darkness threatening to consume his soul. At the same time, Ethan reconnected with Michael Shaw, the idealistic lawyer who took on his case. Michael believed in Ethan's innocence and was willing to fight to the end to prove it. Together, Ethan, Lucas, and Michael formed an unlikely but powerful alliance. They began to investigate Mark and Daniel's movements in depth, uncovering new evidence that could change the story's course. As the months passed, Ethan began to realize that prison, though brutal, had transformed him. He was no longer the man obsessed with success at any cost. He had learned to value what really mattered: his family, his dignity, and his truth. And now, armed with knowledge and determination, he was ready to face those who betrayed him. The months in prison transformed Ethan Carter from a defeated man into someone determined to reclaim his life. He was no longer the successful businessman who once dominated deals with a simple phone call. Now, he was in the trenches of a personal battle, fighting for the truth and his own survival. The help of Lucas and the frequent conversations with Michael Shaw, his lawyer, had given him the confidence and knowledge needed to face his enemies. Each new day, Ethan spent hours in the prison library, immersed in documents and laws. He read cases similar to his, looking for loopholes and defense points that could be used in his situation. Lucas, always by his side, reviewed every detail, offering advice based on his experience as a former lawyer. The setting was very different from the elegant meetings Ethan was used to attending, but somehow he now felt stronger than ever. Michael Shaw, on the other hand, was relentless in his pursuit of justice. He and Ethan had formed a solid partnership, and Michael was determined to prove his client's innocence. "I believe in you, Ethan," he often said during visits. "But believing isn't enough. We need concrete evidence to overturn the charges. And that won't be easy." Ethan knew Michael was right. The evidence against him had been carefully forged by Mark Benson and Daniel Woods, his former partners, and dismantling this web of lies would be a tough task. However, with the help of Michael and Lucas, Ethan began to uncover flaws in his traitor's plan. Small details that had gone unnoticed initially now began to emerge, revealing the conspiracy's plot. During one of Michael's visits to the prison, he brought news that rekindled Ethan's hope. "We gained access to documents that were being blocked by the court," Michael said, opening a folder full of papers. "These are financial transfers that clearly show Mark and Daniel diverted large sums of money to overseas accounts. They used your name to hide the transactions, but the bank records point to them." Ethan looked at the documents with wide eyes. "So, we finally have something?" he asked, almost in disbelief. "We do. But this is just the beginning. We need to find more evidence, something that directly links the two to the scheme, while proving you were a victim of the conspiracy," Michael replied. The following weeks were a whirlwind of hard work and focus. Michael continued investigating outside the prison, and each new discovery seemed to bring Ethan a step closer to the truth. He learned that some of his company's employees, those silenced by Mark and Daniel, were willing to talk. Key witnesses, like accountants and financial assistants, began cooperating, providing information that confirmed Michael's suspicions. The web of lies created by Mark and Daniel slowly began to unravel. Each new discovery made the extent of the betrayal clearer. Ethan remembered all the times he blindly trusted his partners, never imagining they were manipulating the company's finances behind his back. "How could I have been so naive?" he frequently asked himself, with a mix of anger and disappointment in himself. However, Lucas always reminded him it wasn't his fault. "They used your trust against you, Ethan. That doesn't mean you were weak. It means they were dishonest." Finally, after months of investigation and building a solid case, Michael managed to schedule a new court hearing. This would be the moment Ethan had a chance to prove his innocence and confront those who betrayed him. The anxiety within him grew, but also a sense of relief. He knew the moment of truth had arrived. The day of the trial came, and Ethan was escorted from the prison to the courthouse. The pressure was immense. His family wasn't present, and he knew that, for Rachel and his children, this process was as painful as it was for him. However, Ethan also knew he had to move forward, for himself and for everyone who still believed in him. As he entered the courtroom, he saw Mark Benson and Daniel Woods for the first time since his imprisonment. The two were sitting with their respective legal teams, their expressions arrogant and confident. They believed they still had control of the situation, that Ethan would never be able to defend himself. But Michael had built a strong case, and the evidence was on their side. The tension in the room was palpable when the judge entered, and the first witnesses began to be called. Accountants and employees from Ethan's company gave their testimonies, explaining how Mark and Daniel had manipulated the finances, hidden transactions, and diverted money. Each testimony was a blow to the two traitors' plan, and their expressions started to change as the evidence against them piled up. Ethan watched it all with his heart racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. When it was time for Michael to present the evidence, he stood up confidently and began to expose the fraudulent transactions, the offshore accounts, and the forged signatures. The evidence was clear and compelling. Mark and Daniel tried to argue, but their lawyers seemed to realize that the situation was out of control. Finally, the final blow came with the testimony of one of the accountants who had worked directly with Mark and Daniel. He revealed how the two men had created a scheme to frame Ethan, diverting millions of dollars while hiding their own transactions. The room went silent as the accountant's words echoed, and the truth finally came to light. Mark and Daniel were exposed. Their attempts to manipulate the court failed, and their lies were laid bare. The judge, after hearing all the evidence and testimonies, declared that the charges against Ethan were unjust and that he had been the victim of a conspiracy. Ethan was finally exonerated. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, marking the moment Ethan Carter had waited for months. He was free from the charges that had destroyed him. Even so, as the words of acquittal hung in the air, Ethan knew this was just the beginning of a new battle. His former partners, Mark Benson and Daniel Woods, were about to face the justice they had tried to avoid throughout the process. The courtroom, filled with journalists, lawyers, and onlookers, was silent. Ethan looked at Mark and Daniel, the men he once called friends and partners. Now, they were sworn enemies. He could see the fear and disbelief in their eyes, something he had longed to witness. But instead of feeling a complete victory, a mixture of anger and exhaustion consumed him. Mark and Daniel tried to maintain their composure, but the evidence presented by Michael Shaw and the testimonies of the former company employees had shattered their defenses. They knew the walls were closing in. This moment was the result of months of investigation, and now all eyes were on them. "Mr. Benson and Mr. Woods," the judge began, with a cold and controlled voice. "The evidence presented in this court clearly indicates that both of you were responsible for a series of financial frauds, resulting in the destruction of Mr. Carter's career and reputation. You used your positions to manipulate documents and bank transfers in his name while diverting funds for your own interests. This court finds you guilty." The sound of the verdict made the air feel lighter for Ethan. Finally, justice was being served. He looked at Michael, who smiled, satisfied with the case's outcome. The young lawyer had been a crucial part of this fight, and Ethan felt immense gratitude toward him. But as Mark and Daniel were taken away by the authorities, Ethan allowed himself to think about everything he had lost. Though he had been exonerated, the damage to his personal and professional life was nearly irreparable. His company, once one of the largest in the country, had been devastated by the fallout. His accounts were frozen, his assets confiscated, and his reputation, even though judicially restored, was still tainted in the public's eye. Worse still, his family was shattered. Throughout the process, Rachel and the kids had distanced themselves, unable to cope with the pressure. They did not attend the court on the day of his victory, and Ethan knew that repairing those bonds would be an even harder battle than the one he had just won. He had been exonerated in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of his family, he still needed to prove that he was the man of integrity he had always believed himself to be. When the session ended and the reporters began to approach, Ethan avoided the cameras. He wasn't ready for the avalanche of questions and flashes. All he wanted was peace, even knowing it was far from being achieved. That night, after leaving the court, Ethan walked through the streets of Los Angeles, now a free man but profoundly changed. The city lights shone as if nothing had changed, but for him, the world had become unrecognizable. The buildings, the streets, and even the air seemed different. He was no longer the untouchable magnate everyone knew, but a man who had been destroyed inside and out. As he wandered aimlessly, Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He hesitated before answering, but when he saw Rachel's name on the screen, his heart raced. It was the first time in months she had called. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling. On the other end of the line, Rachel sounded distant. "I saw the trial. I know you were acquitted." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief but also sadness. "I wished you were there," he replied, his voice full of emotion. There was a long silence. "I don't know what to say, Ethan. All of this, it was too much. The kids are still confused. I am too." He understood. The pain they went through couldn't be erased with a simple acquittal. He had been unjustly convicted, but the emotional scars of his imprisonment and the impact on his relationship with his family were deep. "Rachel, I know things won't go back to the way they were before. But I need a chance to fix this. I want our family back. I want that too, she replied, her voice softer. But we need time. Things don't resolve overnight. Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll be here waiting. I'll always be here. When the call ended, he knew that the battle to rebuild his life had only just begun. In the days that followed, Ethan reflected on what to do next. He had been exonerated, but his empire was in ruins. Recovering his company seemed impossible, and honestly, he no longer had the same hunger for power that had driven him for so many years. The experience in prison and the trial had changed his worldview. He wanted more than financial success. He wanted purpose. It was during a conversation with Michael, weeks after the trial, that Ethan had an idea. I want to start over, he said, having coffee with the young lawyer in a simple downtown cafe. But I don't want to rebuild my empire. I want to help people who went through what I did. Michael raised his eyebrows, curious. What are you thinking? I want to create an organization to help entrepreneurs who were unjustly accused, people who, like me, were imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. I want to use what I've learned to prevent others from going through what I did. Michael smiled, impressed. That sounds like a great plan, Ethan. And honestly, I think it would be amazing. Your experience could really make a difference. And so, Ethan began working on his new project. With the help of Michael and other professionals, he created a foundation dedicated to offering legal and emotional support to those facing unjust legal battles. This new phase of his life was no longer about wealth or power, but about helping people find justice, something he himself had almost lost. The path was still long. Rebuilding his personal and professional life would not be easy, but Ethan felt he was finally on the right track. He had lost almost everything, but in his journey of downfall and redemption, he had discovered something far more valuable, the strength of character he didn't even know he possessed. Ethan Carter was a free man, but the feeling of relief came with a painful reality. Everything he had built over decades was destroyed. His company, once one of the most respected in the real estate sector, had been dismantled. His assets, once a symbol of power and success, had been frozen or auctioned off. And most painfully, his family was still distant. Rachel and the kids had not returned home, and the silence that once filled his mansion now echoed with a deep emptiness. As he walked through the huge living room of his house, Ethan reflected on everything that had happened. The trial was over, he was free, but the most important fight of his life was just beginning, winning back his family. He knew that the time he spent in prison had marked Rachel and the kids in an irreversible way. They were no longer the same, and neither was he. The weight of betrayal, public humiliation, and loss of trust still hung over them. It was on a cold autumn afternoon that Rachel finally agreed to meet with him. They arranged to meet at a cafe in the city center, away from the curious eyes of the media and friends. Ethan arrived early, more nervous than ever before. With each passing minute, he felt a chill down his spine, an anxiety he couldn't control. He knew he needed this conversation more than anything. When Rachel entered the cafe, Ethan's heart raced. She seemed more distant, more tired, but she was still the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. They exchanged looks for a moment before sitting across from each other. The silence between them was thick, loaded with everything that had happened in recent months. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, trying to break the ice. His voice came out lower than he expected. Rachel sighed, crossing her hands on the table. "I needed time to think, and I think you did too." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, Rachel, not just in business, but with our family. I let work consume me. I wasn't there when you and the kids needed me most, and I paid a high price for that." Rachel observed him for a moment, her eyes full of a mix of pain and compassion. "I know you were unjustly accused, Ethan, and I'm not here to blame you for that, but what happened made us realize a lot of things, about what really matters." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a tightness in his chest. He knew the road to reconciliation would be long. "I want to rebuild what we lost. I know things will never be the same, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I'm still the man you loved." Rachel slowly shook her head. "It's not just about proving, Ethan. It's about learning to be present, to reconnect. The kids and I need time for that. We need to know that you'll be here, not just in body, but in spirit. The silence settled again, but this time it wasn't as uncomfortable. It was the beginning of a dialogue that they knew would need time and patience to blossom. Rachel didn't say she would come home immediately, but the simple fact that they were talking was a huge step for Ethan. In the days that followed, Ethan immersed himself in his new project with the same determination he had applied to his business throughout his life. His foundation, now called Justice and Integrity, was beginning to take shape. He dedicated himself to helping people who, like him, had been unjustly accused or were facing legal battles without the necessary support. With the help of Michael Shaw, Ethan assembled a team of lawyers and experts to provide free legal assistance to entrepreneurs and workers who were victims of fraud or corruption. He knew how difficult it was to fight against a system that often seemed relentless, and he wanted to be the voice for those who didn't have the strength or resources to defend themselves. The first cases for the foundation began to appear, and the feeling of doing something meaningful for others brought a new energy to Ethan. He started meeting with his team almost daily, discussing strategies and helping review cases. For the first time since his downfall, he felt he was in control of something that truly mattered. It was no longer about money or personal success. It was about justice and helping people who desperately needed support. However, each night when he returned to his empty house, the silence still haunted him. He knew his work was just beginning. Winning back his family, although slow, was underway. Rachel began to allow him to see the kids more often, and little by little, Tyler and Emily were also making room for Ethan to return to their lives. But he knew he couldn't rush this process. One night, while looking at the old family photos still decorating the living room wall, Ethan allowed himself to cry for the first time since his imprisonment. The tears were of pain, yes, but also of relief. He had survived something many would not have. He had been destroyed, humiliated, and betrayed, but now he was rebuilding his life, one piece at a time. And in that moment, Ethan understood something fundamental. He wasn't just rebuilding what he had lost. He was creating something entirely new, something more solid, more genuine. His family, his career, and his purpose in life were transforming into something he could never have imagined. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. The days started to have a new rhythm in Ethan Carter's life. The emptiness that once filled his home was slowly giving way to a sense of renewal. Although his family was still distant, he clung to the hope that the conversations with Rachel and the moments with his children provided. And amidst this process, his new mission with the Justice and Integrity Foundation was growing daily, becoming the main driving force in his life. The initial success of the foundation brought a sense of fulfillment that Ethan had never experienced in his years in the corporate world. He was involved in something that made a difference in people's lives. Every day, new cases came up. Small business owners who had been victims of fraud, workers facing unjust trials, and families ruined by wrongful accusations. Through the foundation, Ethan felt he could give people back the justice he had almost lost. However, the challenge of balancing his work and winning back his family remained constant. Each visit from Rachel and the kids was a step forward, but he knew there was still much to rebuild. Tyler, his teenage son, was the most resistant. The emotional distance caused by the scandals and Ethan's imprisonment had left deep scars on the boy. Emily, being younger, was more open, but there was still a certain mistrust in her eyes when she looked at her father. One Saturday morning, Ethan received a message from Rachel. "We're ready to spend a weekend together. The kids want to try. Let's take it slow, but I think it might help us." Ethan read the message several times, unable to contain the smile spreading across his face. The idea of spending a weekend with his family seemed almost unreal after everything they had been through. He knew it would be an important test for everyone, but he was willing to do whatever it took to regain their trust. The weekend arrived, and Rachel, Tyler, and Emily came to the house that was once their home. The atmosphere was still tense, but there was a mutual willingness to try to start over. Ethan had prepared everything for a simple weekend, without luxuries or grand gestures, just time together. The first few hours were filled with uncomfortable silences and polite but cold conversations. Tyler, in particular, seemed withdrawn, responding with only a few words. Emily, however, was curious about Ethan's new work with the foundation, and he felt excited to talk about something that filled him with purpose. "So, you help people who were accused of things they didn't do?" she asked while Ethan prepared dinner. "Yes, exactly," he replied with a smile. "I spend my time trying to make sure others don't go through what I did. I want them to have a fair chance to defend themselves." Emily looked at him with admiration in her eyes. "That's really cool, Dad." That simple compliment warmed Ethan's heart. It was a sign that, despite everything, there was still a place for him in his children's lives. That evening, as dinner was being served, Ethan decided to talk to Tyler. He knew his son was dealing with feelings of anger and confusion and wanted to open a space for an honest conversation. "Tyler, I know things have been hard for you," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to know that I'm here, and I'll always be here if you need to talk about how you feel." Tyler looked at his father for a moment, the silence filling the air between them. Finally, he sighed and replied with a tone of frustration. "I just don't understand. How did this all happen? How did you leave us like this?" The pain in Tyler's voice was evident, and Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "I made a lot of mistakes, Tyler," he said sincerely. "I let work take over everything and wasn't there when you needed me most. And then, when everything fell apart, it got even worse. But I'm trying to change. I want to fix things between us, and I'll fight for that every day if I have to." Tyler shook his head, clearly still struggling with his feelings. "I just need time." "I understand," Ethan responded, "and I'll give you all the time you need." That night, while the children slept, Ethan and Rachel had their first honest conversation since the beginning of all the turmoil. Sitting on the porch under the gentle glow of the stars, they talked about what they had lost, but also about what they could rebuild. "You've changed, Ethan," Rachel said after a long silence. "I can see that. You're not that man obsessed with success and power anymore. You found something bigger." Ethan smiled sadly. "Prison broke me, Rachel, but in a way it also rebuilt me. I realized I spent years chasing the wrong things. Now all I want is to live honestly and be here for you and the kids. If I can have that, I'll be at peace." Rachel sighed, looking out at the horizon. "I believe you, but we need to take it slow. The wounds are still open." "And I'll respect that," Ethan replied, gently holding her hand. The next morning, while they were preparing breakfast together, there was a sense of hope in the air. It felt like, little by little, the fragmented pieces of Ethan's life were slowly coming back together. Back at the foundation, the work continued to grow. People from different parts of the country started reaching out to Ethan, interested in his story and the mission of justice and integrity. The project expanded quickly, attracting lawyers and volunteers eager to fight alongside Ethan for justice and transparency. He was becoming a beacon of hope for those who had lost everything, just as he had, but now had a new chance. Months later, Rachel and the kids began spending more time with Ethan. They didn't move back in together right away, but the emotional distance was shrinking. Each weekend they spent together was a victory, and Ethan held on to the hope that in time, his family would be whole again. The new life he was building wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. Ethan finally understood that true wealth wasn't in his bank account numbers or the contracts he signed. It was in the relationships he was rebuilding, the values he had rediscovered, and the purpose he now carried with him. Months passed since Ethan Carter started his new journey, and each day he felt closer to reconnecting with everything that truly mattered. His life, once marked by material success, now had an emotional depth he had never experienced before. The Justice and Integrity Foundation continued to grow, becoming a respected force in the legal world. But above all, his family was returning to the center of his life. Rachel and the kids now visited regularly, and Ethan noticed with gratitude the progress being made. Conversations were lighter, and laughter started to fill their shared moments again. Although they still lived apart, the bond between them was slowly being rebuilt. And that was what gave Ethan the strength to keep going. One day, while Ethan was working in his office at the foundation, he received a message that made his heart race. It was from Rachel. "We want to talk to you. Can we come by your place tonight?" Immediately, Ethan felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. He knew this conversation could mean many things, but chose not to set any expectations. By now, he had learned that everything required patience and respect for each other's pace. That evening, Rachel, Tyler, and Emily arrived at Ethan's house together. As they entered, there was a different feeling in the air. It was no longer the weight of the past hanging between them, but something lighter, almost hopeful. Sitting in the living room, Ethan watched them closely. Tyler seemed less tense, and Emily, as always, smiled with her sweet and curious nature. Rachel, with a serene look, finally broke the silence. "Ethan," she began, her voice calm but full of meaning. "We've been through a lot as a family. Each of us was affected differently by everything that happened, but the kids and I talked, and we want to try to rebuild our life together." Ethan's heart raced. He looked at Rachel, then at his children, trying to fully understand what she was saying. "We've missed you, Dad," Emily said with a shy smile. "And we know you've changed. We want you to come back." Tyler, though still a bit reserved, nodded. "You're not the same, and I think we can try again. Slowly, but we can." Ethan felt his eyes fill with tears. The words he had hoped to hear for months, maybe years, had finally been spoken. I don't know what to say, just that I'm ready. I'm here for you, and I'll do whatever it takes for us to be a family again." Rachel moved closer and took Ethan's hand. "It won't be easy. We have a lot to work through, but we're willing to try, and I think that's the first step." In that moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: true hope. For the first time since his imprisonment, he saw a future for his family. Not the perfect future he once imagined, but an honest one, full of new beginnings and, most importantly, love. The days that followed were full of adjustments. Rachel and the kids started spending more time with Ethan, and the visits gradually became longer. They began planning simple moments together, like watching old movies or preparing family dinners. Each small interaction was a victory. There was no rush, just the certainty that they were moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, the work at the foundation prospered. Ethan became a respected public figure, not for the power or wealth he once accumulated, but for the dedication he now showed in helping others. He was frequently invited to give talks on justice and integrity, sharing his story of overcoming adversity and warning about the dangers of losing oneself in the business world without paying attention to what truly matters. One afternoon, while in a meeting with Michael and other foundation lawyers, Ethan was surprised by an unexpected phone call. It was from a major news network, inviting him to participate in a documentary about public figures who had overcome great adversities. The offer was tempting, but Ethan hesitated. "You deserve to tell your story, Ethan," said Michael, encouraging him. "Your journey can inspire thousands of people who are going through similar situations. You can be a voice of hope." Ethan thought for a moment, remembering everything he had been through. He knew that his story wasn't just about his fall and rise, but about the inner transformation he had experienced. That night, he talked to Rachel about the invitation. "I don't know if I'm ready to revisit all of this publicly," he confessed. "Part of me wants to move on and leave the past behind." Rachel smiled, understanding. "You've already overcome so much, Ethan, but I think sharing your journey can be a form of closure. And, who knows, it might help others find their way." After reflecting, Ethan decided to accept the invitation. Participating in the documentary would be an opportunity not just to tell his story, but to show people that, no matter how tough the circumstances, there's always a chance to start over. The documentary was a success. Ethan's words resonated strongly with viewers, serving not just as a lesson in resilience, but as a message that true wealth often lies in the lessons we learn from our failures. In the end, Ethan felt he had completed a cycle. Life was no longer about the superficial success he had chased for so long. It was about the purpose, integrity, and love he found in his journey of overcoming. And now, with his family by his side and a job that truly mattered, Ethan Carter knew he was ready to live this new chapter of his life with humility, gratitude, and a peace he had never known before. What did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments. We really want to know what you thought. Your participation is very important to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives like this. Thank you for watching.